Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping straight into the mind of Epicurus, a philosophical heavyweight of the Hellenistic era.
That's right. We're talking the period just after Alexander the Great and Aristotle sort of shook things up.
And Epicurus, he's the guy who brought us this, well, completely material view of the universe, right?
Absolutely. Materialist metaphysics, empiricist epistemology, basically. Knowledge comes from the senses, and a hedonistic ethics, though maybe not hedonistic in the way most people think.
Yeah, we'll get into that. He lived from, what, 341 to 271 BC?
Correct. And his big aim really was to help people find tranquility, peace of mind.
By limiting desires and getting rid of fear. Fear of the gods, fear of death.
Exactly. And his ideas really caught on. Epicurean communities were, well, quite popular for a long time.
Which is pretty amazing when you think that most of his actual writings are lost, aren't they?
It's a real challenge. We're mostly piecing things together from later writers.
Like Diogenes Laertius. He saved some letters, apparently.
He did, thankfully. And there's the poet Lucretius, his big work, De Rerum Natura.
On the nature of things.
Right. That's a major source.
Yeah.
But also critics like Cicero and Plutarch. We get perspectives from them, too, though obviously biased.
So we have to keep in mind we're looking through these kind of secondary lenses. Some details are still fuzzy, still debated by scholars.
Definitely. The lack of primary texts means we have to be careful.
Okay. So our mission for you today, listener, is to really get a handle on the core ideas of Epicurean philosophy. We want to focus on what makes his perspective on living well and finding inner peace so, well, distinctive.
That was good.
Let's kick things off with his metaphysics, his view of reality, this whole atoms and void business. What's the basic picture?
Okay, so at the heart of it is atomism. Epicurus, much like Democritus before him, believed the universe is fundamentally just atoms, tiny, indivisible bits of matter moving around in the void.
Empty space.
So everything we see, tables, trees, us, just clusters of atoms. Temporary clusters, yeah. And all natural events, lightning, digestion, everything, is just atoms interacting.
Yeah.
No gods pulling strings.
Right, mechanistic. But what made him think it had to be atoms and void? What were his arguments?
Pretty straightforward, really. First, things move. Obvious, right? Well, for movement to happen, there needs to be empty space for things to move into. That's the void.
Okay, motion implies void. Got it. And the second point?
The things we see are compound. You can break them down. A log into splinters, splinters into dust.
But you can't keep doing that forever.
Exactly. If you could divide infinitely, things would just poof into nothingness. To explain why nature has stable patterns, why things persist, you need fundamental, unbreakable building blocks, atoms.
Indivisible, unchanging particles. Okay, that holds together. What about the atoms themselves and the universe they're in? Did he think it had a beginning?
No beginning, no end. For Epicurus, the universe is eternal. Always was, always will be. Simple logic. Nothing can come from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. So if the universe exists now, it must have always existed in some form.
And the atoms, too. They're eternal.
They have to be, as the fundamental constituents.
Yeah.
And our world, our cosmos, just one of countless temporary arrangements of these atoms, an infinite number of worlds.
Infinite worlds. And the universe itself, infinite in size.
Unlimited, yes. Think about it. If there was an edge, what's beyond the edge? You could always point past it.
So infinite space.
And you need infinite atoms to fill it. Otherwise, the density would be effectively zero. No objects could form.
An infinite void, too.
Yep. Otherwise, where would the infinite atoms move? It all has to be infinite atoms and void for the system to work. It neatly avoids needing a creator outside the system.
Okay, so he borrowed atomism from Democritus, but he tweaked it, right? Made some changes.
Significant ones, yes.
Yeah.
He wasn't just repeating Democritus. Take weight, for instance.
Wait, Democritus didn't think atoms had weight.
He mostly explained their motion by collisions. But Aristotle had pointed out, well, what got them moving in the first place. Epicurus said atoms have inherent weight. That's why they naturally move downwards. It explained gravity, basically.
Ah, okay. So weight explains the initial downward tendency? What else did he change? Something about randomness?
The famous swerve, the Kleinomen. He imagined atoms generally falling downwards due to weight, like rain.
Parallel lines never meeting.
Exactly, as Lucretius described it. If they just fell straight, they'd never collide to form anything. So Epicurus proposed that occasionally, unpredictably, an atom just swerves, veers slightly off course.
Just randomly.
Just randomly. This had two huge implications. First, it allows atoms to bump into each other, stick together, form complex bodies. It makes the universe possible.
Okay, solves the collision problem. And the second reason?
Free will. This was crucial for Epicurus. If atoms only ever moved in straight, predictable lines based on prior causes, everything would be predetermined, like clockwork.
Our choices wouldn't really be choices.
Precisely. Cicero mentions Epicurus was worried about fatalism. If atomic motion is strictly causal, then our deliberations are pointless. The swerve introduces a tiny element of indeterminacy, breaking that causal chain. It makes space for genuine human agency.
Wow. Connecting quantum-level randomness almost to free will, that's quite a leap.
It is a controversial one, but vital to his system.
Okay, wait, the swerve. What was the third big difference from Democritus? Something about qualities, like colors or taste.
Yes, sensible qualities. Democritus was a bit of a skeptic here. He thought things like sweet or white weren't really in the objects, just subjective effects on us. By convention, he said.
Meaning they're just how we happen to perceive them.
Right. He noted how honey might taste sweet to a healthy person, but bitter to someone sick. So he doubted senses gave us the objective truth about objects.
But Epicurus disagreed. He thought sweetness is a real property.
Well, not of individual atoms. Atoms themselves aren't sweet or white. But he argued that the arrangement and interaction of atoms in a macroscopic object like honey gives that object a real objective power or capacity to produce the sensation of sweetness in us.
So the property is relational but still real, tied to the atomic structure.
Exactly. He used examples like being healthy or mortal or even enslaved. These are properties of groups of atoms, often in relation to other things, but they're real properties nonetheless. Sweetness is like that.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, stepping back from the atoms themselves, Epicurus really wanted to explain everything naturally, didn't he? Get rid of superstition.
Absolutely. Replacing purpose-driven or teleological explanations and myths about gods with mechanistic ones was central. Earthquakes, lightning, these weren't angry gods, just atoms doing their thing.
Why was that so important?
To remove fear. Fear of unpredictable, interfering gods was a major source of anxiety. If you understand the natural causes, you don't need to live in fear of divine punishment.
He even tried to explain apparent design in nature without a designer, right? Like why teeth are good for chewing.
Yes. Following Empedocles, he proposed something like natural selection. Random combinations of body parts arose, and only the functional combinations, like well-formed animals with useful teeth, survived and reproduced. It wasn't Aristotle's idea of inherent purpose or the Stoics' divine plan, just chance and selection.
Okay, so if natural phenomena don't need gods, where did that leave the gods in his system? Was he just an atheist hiding it?
He was often accused of atheism, but he explicitly said gods do exist.
But
But they're totally different from how people imagine them. They are perfectly blessed, happy, tranquil beings. They live in the spaces between the worlds, the intermundia.
between worlds, and they don't do anything.
Nope. Getting involved in human affairs or running the universe would disturb their perfect peace. That would be incompatible with being a god, in his view. So they're completely indifferent to us.
So why believe in them at all? What's their function?
Primarily as ethical role models. We should strive to emulate their perfect tranquility, their ataraxia. They show us the ideal state of being.
Not beings to fear, but ideals to aspire to.
Exactly. Now, critics did say this sounded like a convenient way to avoid trouble for being an atheist. And there's a philosophical puzzle. How can these gods be immortal if they're made of atoms, like everything else, and all compounds eventually break apart?
Yeah. How did he solve that?
It's unclear for the texts we have. Some scholars suggest maybe he thought of them more as ideal thought constructs, perfect concepts existing in human minds, maybe generated by the finest atomic images. But that's interpretation.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift focus slightly. The mind. Epicurus had some pretty modern-sounding ideas about the mind and body, didn't he?
Remarkably so. He proposed an early version of what we'd now call mind-body identity theory.
Meaning the mind is the body, or part of it.
Essentially, yes. He argued mental processes are physical atomic processes. Now, he located the main part of the mind, the seat of thought and emotion, in the chest, which was common Greek thinking then, not the brain.
Okay, location aside, the key idea is that mind is physical, atoms.
Yes. His reasoning was based on interaction. The mind affects the body, think voluntary movement, blushing from embarrassment, and the body affects the mind, illness, intoxication, sensory input.
And only physical things can interact with physical things.
That was his principle. Only bodies can touch or be touched, act or be acted upon. Empty void can't do anything. Plato's immaterial soul couldn't interact with a physical body, so the mind must be bodily, composed of atoms.
What kind of atoms did he think made up the mind?
Very special ones. Extremely fine, mobile atoms. He identified 4 types: fire-like, air-like, wind-like, and a 4th, unnamed element, even subtler than the others.
Why so fine and mobile?
To explain how quickly the mind reacts, how sensitive it is, especially to those incoming atomic images, the idola, that constitute perception.
Idola.
Right, we'll get back to those.
Yeah.
Did he distinguish different parts of this mind-body system?
He did. There was the mind proper, located in the check, the central consciousness for sensation and thought. But then there was also the spirit, a similar atomic substance diffused throughout the whole body.
Like a network?
Kind of, facilitating sensation and communication between the limbs and the central mind. You could loosely compare it to a central versus peripheral nervous system, maybe.
Okay, so if the mind is just a specific arrangement of these fine atoms within the body, what happens at death?
Annihilation, pure and simple.
The mind just stops.
The body structure that holds those mind atoms together breaks down. The atoms disperse. The specific configuration that is the mind ceases to exist. The atoms themselves are eternal, they just go off to form other things, but the conscious, feeling self, gone.
No afterlife, no reincarnation, just the end of awareness.
Exactly, a stark conclusion, but central to his goal of eliminating the fear of death. Before we get to that fear, how did he think we perceive the world in the first place? Those idola you mentioned.
Right. His theory of perception is quite literal. He thought objects continuously shed thin films, like layers of atoms, from their surfaces. These are the idola, or images.
Like peels coming off an onion, but super thin and atomic.
Sort of, yeah. These films fly through the void, maintaining the shape and structure of the object's surface, and strike our sense organs.
So vision happens when these atomic images hit our eyes.
Precisely. And hearing happens when streams of atoms from the source hit our ears. Taste involves atoms from food interacting with atoms on our tongue. Smooth atoms cause sweetness, jagged ones cause bitterness, and so on.
And this ties back to his idea about sensible qualities being real.
Yes, because the structure of the idola reflects the real atomic structure of the object's surface, which has the real capacity to cause a specific sensation. Perception gives us direct contact with the properties of things via these images.
Okay, so that's the world according to Epicurus. Atoms, void, natural processes, mortal minds. Now, how did he think we could actually know any of this? His epistemology.
He was a staunch empiricist. All knowledge comes from experience, ultimately from the senses, and he was strongly anti-skeptical.
He thought the senses were reliable then, unlike Democritus.
Yes, fundamentally reliable, if used correctly.
Yeah.
His main work on this, the canon, is lost, sadly. So again, we rely on summaries. But we know he had 3 basic criteria, or standards, of truth.
Okay, what's the first one?
Sensations. Eistasis, direct sensory experiences. These give us our raw data about the external world.
But can't senses deceive us? A straight stick looks bent in water.
Epicurus would say the sensation itself, the visual image of the bent stick, isn't false. It's a true reflection of the atomic idola reaching your eye after refracting through water. The error comes later if you judge that the stick is bent without further investigation.
So sensation is passive reception. Judgment is where error creeps in.
Exactly. Sensation itself is incorrigible, never wrong. You can test judgments based on sensation, with more sensations, like pulling the stick out of the water.
Okay, sensation is criterion 1. What's 2?
Preconceptions, or prolapses. These are basic concepts stored in the mind, like human, horse, body, useful, true.
Where do they come from?
From repeated sensory experiences. Seeing many humans leads to a stored general image or concept of human. These are crucial. Without them, you couldn't even begin to identify things or make judgments. They're like mental templates.
So they form naturally from experience.
Yes, imprinted on our material minds. They solve that problem of how you learn anything new. You need some existing concepts to start with. We build more complex ideas by analogy, similarity, or combining these basic preconceptions.
Okay, sensations, preconceptions. And the third criterion.
Feelings, specifically pleasure and pain.
How are feelings criteria for truth?
They are the criteria for value, for what to pursue and avoid. They are immediate, undeniable indicators of what is good, pleasure, and bad, pain, for us, foundational for his ethics.
Right, so with these criteria, he felt pretty confident we could gain real knowledge, despite the skeptics.
Very confident. He had specific arguments against skepticism. Remember, Democritus leaned a bit skeptical, so Epicurus needed to counter that.
What were his counter-arguments?
One is called the lazy argument, or sometimes the inaction argument. Basically, if you were a total skeptic, truly believing nothing could be known, you'd have no reason to choose one action over another.
You wouldn't know if eating is better than starving.
Right. You couldn't act. You couldn't live. Consistent skepticism is practically impossible.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
The argument from self-refutation. It's a classic. If a skeptic says, nothing can be known, you ask, do you know that?
If they say yes, they contradict themselves.
Exactly. If they say no, well, then their claim has no force. Why should we believe them if they don't even claim to know it's true?
Gotcha. Clever.
Yeah.
Was there a third one?
Yes, the argument from concept formation. Skeptics use words like knowledge, truth, proof to make their arguments. But where do they get these concepts?
From experience. From the senses.
According to Epicurus, yes. Concepts ultimately derive from sensory experience. If the skeptic claims senses are totally unreliable, they undercut the very basis for the concepts they need to make their skeptical argument.
So you can't use sense-derived concepts to argue senses are useless?
Pretty much, yeah. It's pulling the rug out from under yourself.
Okay, a solid defense of knowing things through experience.
Yeah.
Now let's finally get to his ethics. This is what he's really famous for, right? Hedonism, pleasure is the goal.
It is. Epicurean ethics is definitely a form of hedonism. Egoistic hedonism, specifically. The only thing intrinsically good for its own sake, is your own pleasure. Everything else, money, friends, virtue, is only good as a means to getting your own pleasure.
Okay, sounds straightforwardly selfish. Eat, drink, and be merry.
But that's the common caricature, often confusing him with the Cyrenaics, who are much more about intense, immediate bodily pleasures. Epicurus' view of pleasure was, well, much more nuanced.
How so?
His version of hedonism actually leads to recommending a life of virtue, simplicity, and moderation. It's almost ascetic in some ways.
Okay, that sounds paradoxical.
Yeah.
Pleasure is the goal, but live moderately. Why? First, why did he think pleasure was the ultimate good anyway?
Two main lines of reasoning. First, psychological hedonism. He believed, just by observing infants or even animals, that all beings naturally pursue pleasure and avoid pain. It's instinctual.
So we're just wired that way. Even complex adult actions are ultimately for pleasure.
He thought so. Epicureans spent a lot of time trying to show how even seemingly selfless acts, like helping a friend, ultimately aim at the helper's own long-term pleasure or avoidance of pain.
Debatable, but okay. What was the second justification?
Direct experience, tying back to his epistemology. Just like we immediately perceive heat as hot, we immediately perceive pleasure as good and pain as bad. It's self-evident, requires no further proof.
Like the feelings being criteria.
Exactly. Now, again, this doesn't strictly prove only pleasure is intrinsically good, but for Epicurus, it was the undeniable starting point.
Okay, so pleasure is the goal. But you said it's nuanced. Not all pleasures are equal.
Definitely not. While all pleasure is good in itself and all pain bad, he stressed that it doesn't mean we should choose every pleasure or avoid every pain. This is where prudence, practical wisdom, phronesis comes in.
You have to calculate.
Yes, you need to weigh the consequences. Sometimes a short-term pleasure leads to much greater long-term pain, like a hangover. Sometimes enduring short-term pain leads to greater long-term pleasure, like exercising or studying. It's about maximizing overall pleasure in the long run.
Okay, long-term calculation. Did he distinguish types of pleasure too?
Crucially, yes. He distinguished between kinetic pleasures and catastematic pleasures.
Kinetic and catastematic. What's the difference?
Kinetic pleasure is the pleasure in process, the act of enjoyment while satisfying a desire, like the pleasure of eating when you're hungry or drinking when thirsty. It involves stimulation, change.
That sounds like what most people mean by pleasure.
It is. But for Epicurus, the higher, more stable form of pleasure was catastematic. This means static or standing pleasure. It's the state after the desire has been satisfied.
Like feeling full after eating, not being hungry anymore.
Exactly. The state of satiety, of equilibrium, of not being disturbed by any pain or need. For Epicurus, this absence of disturbance, physical pain, mental anxiety, was the highest pleasure.
So the best state is just not being bothered. Tranquility.
Pretty much. He actually denied there's a neutral state between pleasure and pain. Any unmet need is a form of pain or disturbance. So the complete absence of disturbance is the highest pleasure. Ataraxia.
Ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance.
Yeah.
And aponia, freedom from physical pain. Those are the goals.
Those constitute the highest pleasure, yes. He also distinguished physical versus mental pleasure pains. Physical is just about the present moment.
Like stubbing your toe now.
Right. But mental pleasures and pains are much more powerful, he thought, because they involve the past, pleasant memories, regrets, and, crucially, the future, confidence, hope, or fear and anxiety.
And anxiety about the future is the big enemy.
The biggest, especially fear of the gods and fear of death. If you can eliminate those and trust that your basic needs will likely be met, you achieve ataraxia. That's why some call him a tranquilist more than a hedonist.
Okay, that recasts hedonism quite a bit. To achieve this tranquility, we need to manage our desires, right? He had categories for those.
Yes, this is key to the practical side. He divided desires into 3 types. First, natural and necessary desires.
Like food, water, shelter, basic survival stuff.
Yes, and maybe basic companionship. These are natural, essential for life, or basic comfort. He thought they were generally easy to satisfy, hardwired into us, and bring great pleasure when fulfilled because they remove pain. They're also naturally limited. You only need so much food. His advice: fulfill these.
Makes sense. What's the second type?
Natural but unnecessary desires. These are still rooted in nature but not essential. Think desire for gourmet food instead of plain bread, or a fancy house instead of basic shelter.
So variations on the necessary desires.
Right. Epicurus wasn't against enjoying these if they come easily, without trouble or dependency, but actively chasing them or becoming reliant on them leads to trouble because they can be harder to satisfy and create anxiety. Don't cultivate dependence on them.
Okay. And the third type, the ones to really avoid.
Vain and empty desires, or groundless desires. These are for things like immense wealth, political power, fame, status symbols.
Why are they so bad?
2 reasons. 1, they are unnatural, largely instilled by society and false beliefs, not by our actual needs. 2, they are unlimited. How much wealth or power is ever enough? You always want more. They're inherently unsatisfiable.
So they guarantee frustration and anxiety.
Exactly. They stem from false beliefs, like thinking more money automatically means more security or happiness, Epicurus said. Eliminate these desires entirely. Root them out.
That famous quote comes to mind: if you want to make Pythocles rich.
Don't give him more money. Rather, reduce his desires. Perfect summary. True happiness comes from having few, easily satisfiable desires, eliminating the pain of longing and the anxiety about the future. That is the pleasant life.
A life of simple pleasures, focused on necessities. Where do virtues fit in? Courage, justice, moderation. He didn't dismiss them.
Not at all. He insisted virtues are necessary for happiness. You can't achieve lasting pleasure and tranquility without being courageous, temperate, wise, and just.
What? How? If pleasure is the only intrinsic good?
The virtues are purely instrumental goods. They are valuable only because they lead to pleasure and help avoid pain. They have no value in themselves.
So courage isn't good for its own sake, but because being courageous helps you face necessary pains or avoid greater future pains, thus maximizing overall pleasure.
Precisely. All the virtues, for Epicurus, are really applications of prudence, for Nisus, calculating your own best interest in the long run. This is very different from the Stoics, who said virtue is happiness, or Aristotle, who saw happiness as activity in accordance with virtue.
Even philosophy and science are just tools for pleasure.
Yep. Natural science is useful because understanding atomic explanations for earthquakes or lightning removes the fear of angry gods. Philosophy is useful because it shows us the limits of desire and removes the fear of death. All tools for achieving ataraxia.
Okay, let's look at justice specifically. He had an interesting take. It's a kind of social contract.
Yes, he's considered an early contractarian. Justice isn't some cosmic principle or divine law. It's basically an agreement, a pact among people, neither to harm nor be harmed.
An agreement for mutual benefit.
Exactly. It's a preconception, derived from experience, of what is useful in mutual associations. People band together for security, and they need rules to make that work. Don't kill each other, respect property, etc. Justice only exists where such agreements are made.
So, like virtues, justice is only instrumentally good. Good because it's useful.
Entirely. Its value lies in the security and peace it provides for the members of the society.
What's the motivation to be just, then, on this view, especially if you think you can get away with injustice?
The primary deterrent is fear of punishment. Getting caught obviously brings pain. But Epicurus adds that even if you aren't caught, the constant fear of being discovered poisons your tranquility. That anxiety is itself a pain to be avoided.
So the wise person is just because they don't want that anxiety.
Partly, yes. But also the truly wise Epicurean, who has cultivated simple desires and doesn't crave excessive wealth or power, simply has no motive for acting unjustly in the first place. They recognize the utility of the laws for maintaining the peaceful society they need for their own tranquility.
But is any law agreed upon automatically just?
No, there's a critical element. Justice arises from agreement, but it's grounded in utility. Only laws that are actually useful, that genuinely contribute to the security and well-being of the community members are truly just.
So a law against murder is just because it's useful for everyone's safety.
Right. But maybe a discriminatory law that harms one group for no overall benefit wouldn't be truly just, even if agreed upon. And what's useful can change with circumstances, so just laws might differ between societies or change over time.
That's quite a pragmatic view. Now, one thing Epicurus seemed to value incredibly highly was friendship. He sounds almost unhedonistic about it sometimes.
He really did praise it extravagantly. Friendship dances around the world. It's what helps us awaken to blessedness. He even said the wise man would sometimes die for a friend.
Which sounds not very egoistically hedonistic, willing to die for someone else's sake.
It's caused a lot of debate. Does friendship contradict his core egoism?
Yeah.
Did he value the friend for their own sake?
What's the standard Epicurean explanation? How does it fit?
The main argument is that friendship, while perhaps the highest extrinsic good, is still ultimately valued because it brings immense pleasure and security to oneself.
How so?
Friends provide the greatest source of mutual aid and protection in a potentially hostile world. Life without friends is lonely, vulnerable, and fearful. Having trustworthy friends you can rely on and who rely on you is perhaps the single biggest contributor to long-term security and therefore tranquility.
So the trust and care and friendship are essential for the pleasure of security.
Yes. The Epicurean communities, the gardens, were built around this ideal of shared life among friends, supporting each other's pursuit of ataraxia. It's the ultimate utility for a pleasant life.
Okay, that ties it back. Finally, let's tackle death head-on. Eliminating the fear of death was a huge part of his project.
Absolutely central. He saw it as perhaps the biggest source of unnecessary anxiety plaguing humankind, often tied to fears of judgment or suffering in an afterlife.
And his solution was?
To understand what death actually is.
Yeah.
Annihilation of consciousness. Remember, the mind is just atoms. When the body breaks down, the mind disperses. No sensation, no awareness, nothing.
So if there's no afterlife to fear, what about fearing the state of non-existence itself?
He had arguments against that too. The most famous is the no-harm argument.
How does that go again?
Premise 1. Death is annihilation, loss of all sensation. Premise 2. Something can only be bad for you if you exist to experience it as bad.
Okay.
So when you are alive, death has not yet occurred, so it isn't bad for you now.
Right.
And when you are dead, you no longer exist to experience anything good or bad. Therefore, death cannot be bad for the dead.
So death is bad neither for the living nor for the dead. It's literally nothing to us.
Precisely. As he put it, death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us. But when death comes, then we do not exist. Worrying about it now is pointless if the state itself involves no suffering.
It's logically tight. What about the argument from symmetry? That was Lucretius, right?
Yes, Lucretius beautifully presents the symmetry argument. He asks us to compare the infinite time after our death, when we won't exist, to the infinite time before our birth, when we didn't exist.
We don't usually feel distress about the time before we were born.
Exactly. We weren't around, and it doesn't bother us. So why, Lucretius asks, should we be terrified by the mirror image, the infinite time of non-existence after we die? Nature holds up our prenatal non-existence as a preview of our post-mortem non-existence. If one isn't bad, the other shouldn't be other.
Two powerful arguments aimed at dissolving that fear entirely.
That was the goal. Remove fear of gods, remove fear of death, understand your natural limited desires, and tranquility. The highest pleasure becomes attainable.
So wrapping up, the core of Epicureanism is really this quest for tranquility, for ataraxia, achieved by understanding the world as material, atoms and void, managing desires down to the natural and necessary, and overcoming fear, especially of death and divine meddling.
That's it, in a nutshell. And the surprising twist is how this seemingly self-centered hedonism leads to advocating a simple, virtuous life, where things like justice and friendship are incredibly important, but valued for the peace and security they bring us.
It definitely flips the script on what pursuing pleasure might mean. Not chasing highs, but cultivating a stable state of inner peace and contentment through understanding nature and our place in it.
A very different path to happiness than many others on offer, then and now.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners. Considering Epicurus's arguments, how might we look at our own lives, our own fears, our own desires? Are there things in modern life, the constant push for more, the anxieties fueled by media that Epicurus would say are just major obstacles to tranquility?
It certainly makes you think, doesn't it? What desires are truly necessary and which are just vain and empty, creating noise rather than happiness? A very relevant question, perhaps.
Guys, See you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.